Gypsy boy came whistling through the woods, doing what he'd done for a long, long time, just following his feet and seeing where they took him. And he'd done that as long as he could remember, really. He didn't know half the places he'd been to, he couldn't remember the other half, didn't know what their names were, but he'd had all kinds of adventures, seen all kinds of amazing things. And now, though, he had a vague feeling in the back of his mind that perhaps he might like to stay somewhere for a little while. Not settle down forever, but just have a brief rest. And so he came out of the forest at the appropriately named hamlet of Sherwood. And he stood on the top of the ridge looking down on the little village. And further away in the distance he could see the bigger town of Nottingham, with its two hills, the castle on one and the church and the actual town houses on the other, little pool of smoke over the top. And he thought, well, I wonder whether Nottingham might be a place to stay. I wonder what's happening in Nottingham. And so he went down into Sherwood and he found the inn and he got himself a drink and he started chatting to some of the lads who were standing around outside the inn. You know, the kind of people who stand around outside inns. He thought it might be a good source of information, anything that was interesting that was happening in Nottingham. And he discovered that the best way to get information from people is to give them information. So he started to tell them about his adventures, where he'd been, what he'd done, things he'd escaped from, people who'd chased him. One or two of them might have been true, but you know, there was an awful lot of fiction in his stories, but they made good stories and they made people listen. And in return, they started to tell him about things that were happening in Nottingham. And most of it was of no interest to him at all. But then eventually one thing did make him prick up his ears and take notice. Apparently there was a woman in Nottingham. She wasn't very young, you know, she was slightly older, a mature woman, but she was amazingly beautiful. She was probably foreign. They said she spoke with a strange accent, although none of the people he was speaking to had ever spoken to her, ever seen her even. But the main thing, she was very rich, and she was looking for a husband. And so the gypsy boy thought, well, I could do that. I could be husband to a very rich, beautiful, older lady. And so he thought he'd go into Nottingham tomorrow and see what he could find out. Well, there was one other thing that they said, but that sort of went in one ear and out the other. They did say that she'd had 7 husbands before, but he wasn't interested in that. So he found himself somewhere to sleep, in a barn or a shed or something. Next morning he got up early, washed under the pump, found his way down into Nottingham, asked around, and he found the house where this lady lived. A grand, big mansion. Hedges all round it, magnificent gates. And he went in through the gate and found gardens all laid out, flower beds, trimmed hedges, a gravel path right up to the front door. And he made himself walk up to the front door. He didn't usually, because usually when he went to a big house, he was begging for food or money or something. But now he was going as the prospective husband of this lady. So he made himself go up to the front door, banged on the big knocker, and waited, half expecting servants to come out with blunderbuss or set the dogs on him or something. But no, a maid answered the door and just said, "Oh, have you come to marry the lady?" And he said, "Yes." And so they invited him in, and took him into a reception room where there was a table laid up with food and drink, fire burning, flowers on the mantelpiece, food there. And he made himself comfortable for a few minutes until the lady appeared. And she was everything he'd hoped she was. All right, beautiful. Not quite, a bit older than him, but couldn't say she was old, definitely. Beautiful. Did speak with a strange accent, but which he couldn't figure out. And she was obviously rich. And they had a very brief conversation At the end of which she sent for the servant to go and fetch the priest, and they were married that afternoon. That evening, that night, they went to bed, and although he was by no means innocent, she taught him things that he could never imagined could happen. And he went to sleep eventually, really pleased with himself. And this became the pattern. Every evening, every night, they'd go to bed, they'd make love, he'd fall asleep. But then one night he woke up in the night and she wasn't there. And he thought, well, there's all kinds of reasons why ladies might get up and go out in the night. And she was there again in the morning. But he noticed again the next night. And it wasn't just 5 minutes she was gone, it seemed to be a longer amount of time. And so he thought he'd stay awake and he'd see if he could find out why and where she went. First night it didn't work, he just fell asleep. But the next night he managed to wake up just as she was going out of the door. And he pulled on his clothes quickly and followed her. Down the stairs, out of the house, across the garden. And she went through a gate that he'd never noticed before, which led into the churchyard, where he lost her, couldn't see where she'd gone. But after a few minutes, he heard the sound of stones moving, and then the unmistakable sound of someone eating. And he followed these sounds until he peered over a big high table-like grave, and there was his wife in a grave chomping on a huge great chunk of meat. And he was horrified. He said, "My love, what are you eating?" And she looked up at him and said, "Corpse, you fool, corpse." And it was then that he realised where her other 7 husbands had gone.